Did you know that long before the suffragettes marched in London, long before women fought for the right to own property in Europe and America, there were entire African civilizations where women held the land, controlled wealth, and passed down family lineage through their bloodline? What if I told you that the history of women's power doesn't begin where you've been taught it begins? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. A grandmother in the Akan kingdom of Ghana sits beneath the shade of an ancient tree. Her grandchildren gather around her, not just for stories, but for identity. When she speaks, she names their ancestors, not through their father, but through her mother, and her mother's mother. She is the root. She is the foundation. She is the unbroken line. This wasn't poetry. This wasn't symbolism. This was law. This was structure. This was civilization. For centuries, across vast regions of Africa, societies organized themselves around a principle that would still seem radical today. Matrilineality, a system where a child's identity, inheritance, and belonging flowed not from the father, but from the mother. Among the Akan people of present-day Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, women didn't just participate in society, they anchored it. Land, the most valuable resource in any agricultural world, passed through the mother's line. If you wanted to know who owned the fields, who controlled the harvest, who safeguarded the family's wealth, you looked to the women. The Akan had a saying, "It is the woman who holds the nation." And they meant it literally. Yes, a man could be king, but his legitimacy came from his mother's bloodline. The Queen Mother, the Ohima, was not symbolic. She was power. She nominated kings. She could remove them. She advised on matters of war and peace. She guarded lineage and tradition. She stood as the living bridge between ancestors and the present. This wasn't a privilege granted to women. It wasn't a reform. It wasn't a debate. It was simply the way society was built. Now travel east to the Igbo societies of southeastern Nigeria. Here, women controlled the markets. They set prices. They regulated trade. Wealth flowed through their hands, and they governed through powerful councils known as Umwada, assemblies of daughters of the land. When conflict arose, when justice was needed, these women gathered. And when they spoke, the community listened. In 1929, British colonial officers tried to impose new taxes. They went to the men, assuming authority lived there. They were wrong. Tens of thousands of women rose in protest in what became known as the Women's War. No guns, no armies, just unity, strategy, and collective power. The colonizers retreated because these women understood something deeply embedded in their culture. They were not peripheral. They were not powerless. They were essential. Now, let's go north to the Tuareg of the Sahara. Among the Tuareg, women owned property independently. Tents, livestock, wealth belonged to them. A woman could divorce and keep her property. She was often the most educated in the family. She passed down history, poetry, and identity. And here's what still surprises people today. Tuareg men veiled their faces. Women did not. Unveiled, respected, powerful. So here's the question we must ask ourselves. Why weren't we taught this? Why does the story of women's liberation always begin in the West? Why are African women portrayed as victims waiting to be saved, when their grandmothers were landowners, leaders, and kingmakers? Let me take you to Central Africa, to the Bemba people of present-day Zambia. Here, when a man married, he didn't bring his wife to his home. He moved to hers. He joined her clan. Their children belonged to the mother's lineage. If the marriage ended, the children stayed with her. The land was hers. The home was hers. The identity was hers. This wasn't about excluding men. It was about stability, continuity, and honoring the strongest bond humanity has ever known, the bond between mother and child. These weren't isolated examples. These were entire worldviews, lived, practiced, sustained for centuries. And then came colonization. European powers imposed their own gender systems. They ignored queen mothers. They dismissed women's councils. They rewrote laws so land could only pass through men. They didn't just colonize land. They colonized memory. And slowly, the world forgot. But here's what could never be erased. African women were powerful long before the word feminism existed. They didn't demand rights they already had. They inherited them. They exercised them. They passed them down. This isn't distant history. This is foundational history. When people talk about women's liberation, remember this. It didn't begin in the 20th century. It didn't begin in Europe or America. It lived in the markets of Igbo land. It was written into Akan law. It crossed the Sahara with Tuareg mothers. It was rooted in Bimba's soil. If this story moved you, if it made you see Africa differently, subscribe to this channel. Because there are countless stories like this one. Stories of dignity, balance, and brilliance that were buried and are now being reclaimed. So the next time someone speaks of women's rights as a modern invention, remember the grandmothers. Remember the queen mothers. Remember the women who held nations together long before the world told them they could. Africa did not borrow the idea of women's power. Africa taught it, and that is a truth worth remembering.